Hi everyone, welcome to our Netroots Nation panel, Doing It for the Planet, Not Just the Gram. I'm Christy Drutman. I am the host of Brown Girl Green, a podcast and media series where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about diversity and inclusion, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. I am super excited to moderate today's panel with our wonderful panelists because we're going to be diving into a lot of deep and interesting topics around the connections between digital media, culture, and addressing the environmental crises of our time. So I'm really excited to have such a diverse panel with us today. And before I get started, I just wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. So I'm currently recording my moderated panel on Ohlone land in the Bay Area. I wanted everyone here who's listening to also think about the land that you are sitting on, because we all live on stolen Indigenous land. And I think that that's a really important starting point when we are talking about the environmental issues of today's world. So we are going to be having a Google form in the chat where you can fill out your information so we can follow up with you all after this discussion. So keep your eyes out in the chat for that form. We'll be posting it a few times since people are going to be trickling in. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please put it in the question and answer box, and we'll make sure that we get to it during our session. So diving into the purpose of why we came up with this panel. So all of us met, over the past few years through social media. We are all environmental media and content creators who all operate in different capacities to address the climate crisis through our platforms. And I was really excited to, curate this panel and really think about the ways that we could bring our experiences of creating new digital media that both engages people and educates them about environmental issues, but also inspires them to act through storytelling. And I just wanted to say that, we were doing a lot of this work before COVID, before the quarantine hit. So a lot of us work remotely or have done digital media and content creation for months or several years now. So we kind of learned that we were able to adapt to a moment like this, where, there's so many issues bombarding us on the news and et cetera, and we've been able to figure out a way to use social media to teach people about really complex topics related to climate change in a way that's digestible and entertaining. And, the amazing part of this is we all live in different parts of the country, and we all became friends specifically through social media platforms. And so it's really amazing that this panel was allowed to exist just because we met each other through these platforms. So we're hoping that this discussion really raises the awareness of the power of social media as a tool for organizing and for relationship building. And yeah, we also just really wanted to make an acknowledgement that we weren't the first environmental activists by any means. A lot of the work that we're doing now has been laid out for decades by Black, Indigenous, and people of color frontline environmental activists who have fought on the ground, done grassroots campaigns to fight for environmental justice in their communities. And so we just want to say that we want to acknowledge our own privilege and access to be able to host this discussion. And we just want to show that our platforms and the work that we're doing is to serve a bridge to allow people to have access to educational resources that allows them to understand and comprehend the issues at hand, whether it be plastic pollution, whether it be global warming, Indigenous sovereignty over land, so on and so forth. So each one of these panelists today has their own unique technique and takes on how they approach that kind of work. And I'm really excited for them to talk about how they're able to bridge the gap on the lack of resources and knowledge that exists in the mainstream media to actually teach people about these issues. And I feel like a lot of us have done a lot of this work in the grassroots ourselves by being self-funded, by really hustling and creating creative content. And I just really want you all to keep that in mind as we're going into the discussion, that we all come from very diverse backgrounds. And we really wanted to highlight the gaps and the barriers that a lot of people of color face to enter the environmental field, and that social media has been and will continue to be a bridge to bringing more people and more voices to the table. So with that being said, I wanted to introduce our wonderful panelists. So we will have each of them introduce themselves. And we'll start with Ariel.
Hi, my name is Ariel, and I am the owner of the Instagram page Go Green Save Green. I started the page in about 2018, right before I graduated college. I mean, I think I was set to walk like the week before I started the page, or the week after I started the page. When you come to my page, you can expect to find a combination of environmental news, information on like climate and environmental science, so things like how the atmosphere works, how different ecologies work, topics like monoculture, but then also things that are a lot more lighthearted, like environmental memes, environmental infographics, highlighting and sharing other people's work that they're also putting as well. Like I have no problem sharing. I definitely consider myself more of like an amplifier. Because I've been able to build such a great following just over the past 2 years, I've been constantly researching online and finding all these resources for information so that I can share to a larger platform. My following is about 60,000, a little bit more, and it's growing all the time. It's been incredible. I don't have a background in environmentalism. I went to art school, so you can see. So yeah, my approach has definitely been as somebody who didn't necessarily have all the jargon background and all the technological, like a formal education in that. And as such, I hope to also interest and get people motivated who don't necessarily have that academic background or access to that kind of information. And that's me. Yeah. And now Isaiah's.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Isaiah Hernandez, and I'm the creator of Career Brown Vegan. I explore a variety of environmental educational concepts that are presently presented through academia. And so the main picture of my goal is to really explore these concepts and really connect them in a more accessible way for those to really understand with lived experiences. And so I think one of the most important things to realize is that myself being in going to UC Berkeley and doing environmental sciences, I realized that how academics is sometimes inaccessible for a lot of people that come from different backgrounds and school resources. And so I think for me, my main purpose was to really reconnect people, to really empower them to understand that these concepts, although they may be presented in a different light through academia lens, I try to disrupt those barriers by presenting personal lived experiences or cultural, spiritual, and wisdom experiences that are obviously mainly important in environmental education too. And so I think that's one of the reasons that really stem my own interest. So yeah.
Great introduction, Isaiah. And I'll go next. Hey, everybody, if you don't know me already, my name is Gia Chinchilla, and I'm a sustainability and clean technology consultant. I'm a United Nations climate activist, and I'm also founder of Climate Action Lab. Climate Action Lab lives entirely online. We are an environmental justice social media page based on informing young people in the Los Angeles area to take climate action. I think oftentimes, and what Christy mentioned earlier in the introduction, was that a lot of folks, especially people of color, do not feel that they are represented online. So my whole function and purpose of creating Climate Action Lab was for, folks who look like me, or for everybody to feel like they have a place in a community where they can go, feel heard, feel seen, and feel inspired. And we're founded on 3 principles to inform, highlight, and normalize the conversation around Climate Action Lab. And I'm really looking forward to talking more with y'all today.
All right, and hi everyone, I'm Caitlyn. I also go by Kate or Katie. I'm based on Eno and Okanagan lands, currently colonially known as Durham, North Carolina. I'm one of the social media managers for the American office of Greenpeace. If you're not familiar with Greenpeace, we're an international, like, global organization that uses peaceful protest and creative communication to expose global environmental problems and promotes solutions that are essential to a green and peaceful future. I also help manage social media for Native Women's Wilderness, which is an org for which I'm a regional leader. And we utilize social media to reshape the narrative of the outdoors and create space that's inclusive for Indigenous women, femmes, and non-binary folks. So yeah, hi.
Amazing. And yeah, just to finish off what I was saying earlier about my own work. So again, I'm Christy Drutman. I'm the host of Brown Girl Green, which is a podcast, a video, and a blog series that's focused also on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the environmental movement, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. And a lot of my content is focused on being entertaining, focused on my own personal journey as a Filipina American climate activist. And so I focus a lot on personal storytelling, narrative, and also teaching people through infographics and videos about environmental issues. So I'm so excited to dive into this conversation. I wanted to ask Isaiah and Katie our first question. How does your cultural identity and lived experiences inform your environmental activism? And I would love Katie to start off first.
Yeah, so a little bit of my background. So me and my parents were from an environmental justice community in Central California, and my ancestors organized with Cesar Chavez and labor unions for the farm workers movement. So organizing has kind of always been in my blood, and coming of age in this era of the climate crisis, which is the single biggest threat to our humanity, it was never a question that I would mobilize for it and I would organize for it. I also live at the intersection of many different identities, so I've always been able to see activism, specifically environmental activism, from a really intersectional lens and viewpoint because of my lived experiences. And the larger environmental movement has always sadly been overwhelmingly white and white serving, but we know that BIPOC, Black Indigenous people of color, have always and will continue to bear the brunt of pollution and the worst effects of the climate crisis. So my cultural identity as a neurodivergent, mixed Indigenous Asian woman of color has helped me really bridge the gap of what this movement has historically been and where it's going. Intersectionality in this movement is the future. It's the only way forward. And voices like mine and voices like ours, like everybody on this panel, we are going to guide and inform that shift in the movement because of our cultural identity and our lived experiences.
Yeah, that was so beautiful, Caitlyn. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so inspired. I think for me, similar to Katie, a little bit different, is that I grew up obviously in Los Angeles, California, known as Tongvaland. And so for me, growing up in the San Fernando Valley, usually a lot of the EJ communities are focused towards central of LA. And so growing up in where I lived in Silmar and Pacoima, Pacoima is one of the top 1% to 5% most polluted cities in Los Angeles County. And so for me growing up, it was almost as normalized as if living near toxic facilities and the Metrolink causing great noise pollution to your health was kind of normalized. And so I think for me growing up as Mexican American, my parents from Mexico, is that realizing this cultural identity is reconnecting myself into my own roots, but also realizing the fact that within my own identity and culture, it goes against, right? Because there's a lot of rampant homophobia. And so for me, you know, being in this climate movement is ensuring that we recognize that queer ancestors that have been doing this work for decades are obviously being recognized for all the amount of labor that they've done, but also realizing that climate change and LGBTQ plus rights are all interconnected. And so if for one, you know, for me, my main purpose of being in this movement is to ensuring that the people that are the ones that are going to be the most impacted, especially climate refugees, that is something that has been talked about for years. We need to understand that the people that are coming to different countries to seek refuge a lot of these people are usually queer, trans, people who face disabilities. And so ensuring that we obviously create a community that's able to cultivate them, but also ensure that the people that are speaking on behalf of these issues are protected and they're being serviced in this fight for the climate crisis.
Amazing. Thank you both for sharing that. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough, is that we need people who are talking about their cultural identity and talking about how it connected them and brought them into the work as a really important way to bring other people who may not see themselves in typical mainstream environmental spaces, both in like the online mainstream media, but also even on social media. You know, it's really amazing that now we have this new generation of folks like y'all who are very deeply rooted in your identity and know like what are the nuances that bring that to the conversation and how it actually influences the content you put out on different platforms. And just a reminder for anyone who's watching, please put any questions that you want in the chat box, and specifically if there's anyone on this panel you specifically want to direct your question towards, please put that in your question. So moving on to the next question. This is for Ariel and Gia. Given that your work is online and therefore the community or audience you are working with or trying to mobilize is online, how do you feel your content is able to invite people in? And to add on to that, what are some of the strategies that you have employed to create an inclusive environment to talk about these hard and complex topics? And we'll start with Ariel.
Awesome. So I would say that Go Green Save Green, we definitely focus, or me, I definitely focus a lot on making information as easy to understand as possible. So my page isn't just focused on either small, really simple ideas like recycling, but then also really big things like environmental justice and like, so my page kind of, I think of it as like a bunch of bricks, like building bricks. So I'm giving really simple definitions. What are microplastics? What are the different types of plastics? How do mushrooms and fungi help the environment? All these different things that like you might not think of. Some pages really focus on either like plastic pollution, ocean pollution, veganism, whatever. And I try to bring in all these topics together and given all these little definitions, all these examples of real life implementation and stuff like that. And I try to make it so that way, if you were to have no information at all, hopefully I can start with those ground level basic ideas and then build upon those as you're following the page. The other thing to get people roped in, and I cannot stress this enough, is humor. Using humor and relatability and stuff like that. I would say I use memes a lot, and I definitely try to incorporate like the personal struggles that we all deal with. So definitely things like getting your parents to be more eco-friendly, or like feeling really awkward when you use a reusable bag, or like all these kind of awkward moments that you might not necessarily know how to handle, as you're growing into this environmentalist. So yeah, that's, I would say, how I bring people in.
Yeah, and kind of pegging back off of what Ariel said, I would say Climate Action Lab, we deploy kind of the same strategies, but I kind of circle them in and define them by 3 different methods. First, I made sure when growing the team, I mean, originally when I started Climate Action Lab, it was just me, but now we are growing. I make sure that our team is full of a diverse set of voices. Every week, the small staff that I have, we make sure that our content is like not only hitting the mark, but is inclusive. And each post, I kid you not, is like meticulously drafted and revised and revised and revised again by all of the team members. So it really does go through this process of challenging one another and asking, is this reaching, everybody? Is this, centered towards just one group of people? So I really try to make sure that my team and I challenge one another to make sure that what we're, the content that we're putting out is all inclusive. And also jumping off of what Ariel said, we definitely use irony and humor and like the power of meme culture. I think older people really underestimate the power of a meme and like, going viral. And even though I have my own qualms with that and my personal usage of Instagram, I do think that it's really incredible when a viral post, a viral meme, a viral graphic, you know, reaches a wide amount of people, because that means more people are going to digest that information. And then finally, our third strategy is that we just try to make sure that our content is relatable. One thing I always ask myself before we hit send on a post is this something that I would share in my group chat with my friends? Like beyond just, you know, my image as the founder of Climate Action Lab, is this something that I would just be, you know, yeah, sharing? So I always want to make sure that our content can be relatable and it's easy to just insert in your personal chats with friends.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for really touching on those important topics. I think, you know, a lot of people discount the relatability factor. I think especially when it comes to climate science or the urgency of the issue, it's a lot of like, let's throw numbers at people. Why can't people just like figure it out? And then it's like, well, you're not really relating to them or meeting them where they're at. So I think it's really important that, you know, with climate science, as much amazing information and thought leadership that exists out in the world right now to teach people about the concrete facts of the situation, I think at the end of the day, if you're going to actually inspire action, you have to create content that sticks, content that tells a story and makes people understand who you are, what your values are, and why people should listen to you. So I think, you know, Ariel and Gia's pages are really great examples of content that reaches people, like specific audiences, especially young people, to educate them and to make it seem more fun and approachable to address these issues. So thank you both for talking about that. And speaking about this current moment in the context that we're all living within, during COVID times, as we like to call them, climate change is not a top priority or top of mind for families who are struggling and trying to make ends meet to survive. There's also been a lot of momentum around racial justice with the Black Lives Matter movement and addressing the prison industrial complex and so forth that are much needed discussions at this time in history. And so where does climate change fit into all of that? Obviously, this is an area that's very broad, that we're all very passionate about, but we know that talking about the environment and caring about where our planet and humanity is headed with the extraction of resources and carbon emissions, etc., like we do need to be thinking about these things, but we also need to be realistic that this is not top of mind for most people, especially most people in America right now. And so how are we going to actually win a move on climate? Like, how do we actually make that messaging stick to people? And so I wanted to know, you know, how can we continue to contribute to intersectional environmentalism through our content? Because when we're thinking about why it's not top of mind, we have to be thinking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are not currently being given a platform and a voice to really be in this space around sustainable living, caring about the environment, talking about environmental advocacy. It's not, you know, a top priority, even though most of these communities are on the front lines and are disproportionately impacted. So I wanted to ask Ariel and Isaiah, how do you feel like you all are providing a platform for those who may not have a platform to uplift BIPOC communities through your work? And also, like, to add on to that, like, through your own eyes, what is intersectional environmentalism and how is your platform actually like pushing that forward?
Okay, cool. That's a big question. So I would say, at least, so how do I contributing to intersectional environmentalism? Like I said, my platform is about 60,000 big and growing constantly. So something that's really easy for me to do is, because I'm constantly looking for new resources, whenever I find a really good page or a tweet or like a project that's happening online, it's pretty easy for me to share that and give that group or that effort like more spotlight. And I really enjoy doing that because I understand what it's like to not necessarily be taken seriously because of aspects of your identity, things that are like completely out of your control. So I mean, that's the simplest way for me, is to continue to build up my platform and continue to make sure that the focus, when I do give it to people, is on those underrepresented communities. To me, environmental intersectional environmentalism is definitely considering all kinds of people. So that means not just people that can afford nice fancy reusable, but people who are struggling to like make rent. Not just people who are in first world countries, but people who are in third world countries. Not just people who are consuming, but like who are we thinking about? Who is making our clothes? Who is picking our food? All those kinds of things. So really looking at every aspect of society, you know, who gets to live in like nice areas? Who gets to live in dirty, polluted areas? Why are downtowns and, you know, cities like a lot more dirty? Or, you know, who gets to live next to the factories and whose health is impacted? So when you're looking at intersectional environmentalism, you're not just looking at the problem and like who it's affecting on the surface, but you're looking at solutions as well. So things that you might not even consider, like I'm sure that when people realized that the moon affected the tides, like that was a huge like thing, you know. And similarly, there are a lot of things where in climate science and in environmentalism where there is like an ocean moon scenario where two things that you didn't really think impacted each other at all actually have huge like repercussions for one another. So really highlighting those moments to me is what I strive to do.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I think for me, the idea of this theme of like decentering within social media is sometimes hard because I do acknowledge the fact that people often put people on pedestals in social media. And so it's very dangerous when you do that because that obviously creates a false illusion of this individual. And so I think for me, as being an educator on that side, I think my topics with environmentalism is just level one in the sense of like, this is an introduction. And so I think I challenge people to creatively think that if that's all you're doing to think about the climate crisis, you need to challenge yourself to go deeper into this journey. And so I think part of that too is the fact that instilling yourself in your own position, right? I think a lot of us, you know, for me, myself, like thinking about ways of I'm constantly decentering myself in conversations or slash giving that spotlight to someone, or even not just following Black Indigenous organizations, but also working with them directly, offering my free labor to them, offering my own platforms to them. And so I think one of the things about activism, or what you would say sustainable activism, that should be applied is the fact that we need to ensure that we're confidently engaging in it for years. It's not necessarily you do it for a few months and it's over, because frontline grassroots organizations don't have that lifestyle. And so I think part of the reason why, of course, a lot of people critique social media is because the fact that it creates almost a limited boundary. And so I think it's really important that we ensure ourselves as we continue this movement, even myself, is ways to go beyond social media, but also advocating for those that may need the amplification or just a platform to be used on my end.
Yes, that was so good. And I think that was like an amazing segue into our next question, because I think it's really important to always ask yourself, what is your intention and what are your ideas behind how you're running a platform? And that's an important responsibility that those of us that are content creators have to face every day, is how is our content actually serving others, and how is our content going to actually mobilize people for action? Because at the end of the day, that's what needs to happen on the ground, and education through media is the first step, but how do we take that further? And so my next question is for Katie and Gia. I wanted to ask, using social media to drive this work is only as powerful as the relationships we are able to build behind the scenes with frontline climate justice organizers worldwide. Do you have any examples of campaigns or work that you have done on climate justice where you believe social media was critical in building the relationships as well as the buzz necessary to amplify or execute it? And we'll start with Katie.
Yeah, so at Greenpeace, I think a lot of us like to relate our work as Greenpeace to saying that like it's like activism from 30,000 feet, like from that altitude. So we're not the boots on the ground. Our offices are really few and far between, with many of us, like me, sprinkled kind of like in the middle, working remotely. But the truth is, like, we are not on the front lines of like the climate crisis fight. Like, we are not in frontline communities. We're not working in communities like Houston or Cancer Alley, which are like where the petrochemical complex is like really headquartered. and we're not like really on the front lines of fights against the extractive industry of like mining or logging or anything like that. So it's incredibly important for us to ally with the people who are on the front lines, because they know the needs and they know the threats that their community has and faces. So it's really critical for us to support them. And this manifests in a bunch of different ways. Like we do a lot of relationship building with these communities and orgs on the front lines through lots of different ways. But for the purposes of this panel, I'll only really speak on social media. But social media and like digital movement building is, especially now during COVID, it's like, it's so important, and it's absolutely vital to like what we're doing in the fight for the climate crisis, or like the fight for essential workers and everything like that. But we use social media a lot, just like as ways to amplify and give like more attention to the people who are on the front lines. So obviously Greenpeace, we have like 1 million followers across all platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And a lot of the frontline communities don't have these platforms where they're like being seen and heard on this kind of level. So one of the most efficient ways that we can really like lend our platform is by doing shared live streams, or even just amplifying, like sharing their events and sharing their petitions, stuff like that. We write articles about their work for our website, which we then share on our social media, and so on. But we also have really more creative ways that we work to amplify their work, like our social media hive. That's a Facebook group of really deeply engaged Greenpeace volunteers from around the nation, and they use social media to pressure either corporations or politicians or other targets like that. And one of the really cool successes we saw come from that was with the Line 3 pipeline that was going to be built in like Minnesota. And we had our social media hive, they were tweeting at, I think it was the governor of Minnesota, and like putting a lot of pressure on him to be a climate leader, to respect Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous lands. And using that social media pressure really came out in a success when I'm not sure if he delayed or he canceled it altogether, because I know that fight is still ongoing. But the ways that we use pressure to amplify, but also like I guess put pressure on, and I can't find a better like saying for it, that's redundant, but to put pressure on the targets and make them know that our eyes are on them and we're going to hold them accountable. It's a really powerful tool to build relationships with people on the front lines, but also to build really amazing people power behind the scenes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. That was, it's going to be hard to follow up that one, because especially the work that you do is so important. And it's incredible to hear that your guys' efforts, you know, and in partnership with other people have really like led to, you know, change. But before I give, you know, an example of how Climate Action Lab has, you know, helped, you know, mobilize folks, increase engagement around, you know, like a movement, I do want to say that there are power in numbers, and I think people often forget that. And you know, if you have one person share a post about, let's just say like a petition or a ban to stop fracking, yes, that's important. But if you have 2, 10, 100, even like 1,000 people share that post, like that's a movement, not a moment. And allyship is key to getting there. Like, I don't think content could reach that level of, you know, of viewership and reach as many as people without, you know, really partnering with people. So an example of Climate Action Lab, you know, really like partnering with other folks and other accounts and pushing a movement was last summer, when the Brazilian government turned a blind eye to the man-made fires kind of like ravaging the Amazonian jungle. Climate Action Lab partnered with Sunrise Movement, Climate Resolve, and several other smaller environmental justice organizations in the Los Angeles area and in Portland to gather petitions and start pushing out this 4-week-long campaign to get this moment into the news. And as many of you might even remember, you even had celebrities talking about the Amazon fires. And thanks to this mounting in what ended up becoming international pressure, the Brazilian government finally addressed that, you know, they were responsible for those man-made fires. And now they're taking measures to stop deforestation, Now, I'm not saying that the solution, or I'm not saying that the problem is completely solved, but steps were taken to take mobile action. And I think that's important. Also to one of the other Q&A or questions that we got in the Q&A that we're kind of excited to address later. But yeah, like action can be taken from, the viral nature of posts and and the partnerships that lead to the viral nature of that content.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for, leaving people with some tangible examples that they can sit with and understand, actually visualize, like, what does it look like to build movements starting with social media. And it's going to continue to be an important tool, especially like in quarantine and beyond, of figuring out the world that we're trying to build and the stories we want to tell about the world we want to build. And social media is an amazing, groundwork and space for people to figure that out. So as our final question before we head into our Q&A, I wanted to have each person, including myself, let people know what do you feel is the first step people can take to use social media to educate their own community about climate justice. And I'm not going to start because I have to think this over for a second, but I would love to have Ariel start.
Okay, so I think that the very first step that if you want to use social media is like know who you're talking to and know how you can make it enjoyable for them. Honestly, like for me, the biggest thing I think is that I've focused on making my content enjoyable and educational with a little bit more emphasis on enjoyable. Not that the information is important. Obviously, I think the information is incredibly important. But if I put out really important information in a really boring or inaccessible way, nobody's going to read it. So I need to be like very keenly aware that the way I'm presenting information matters. And, depending who you're talking to, the way that, fun information comes about is very, very different. The way that you would reach high schoolers is going to be very different from the way you're going to reach people in their mid to late 20s. So, and also think about like, what is it that you're trying to teach them? Are you trying to teach them things like veganism? Are you trying to teach them more like science, like how different ecosystems work? Like what facet are you trying to engage with, and how, like, think about who it is, what's fun to them, and like what is important about what it is you're doing. And I would say that the biggest tip I can give anybody is people share photos, not captions. So all your information that's like super critically important that you want people to know, text photos are like one of the most powerful tools I can suggest, honestly. Because how many times do people like share a picture and then it says click the caption and people don't click it? So that's what I would say.
And I'll pass it to Isaiah.
I really think it's about intentionality, right? And so I think that a lot of us that are doing social media environmental awareness is understanding that you may have the collective understanding or intent to have good intentions in the sense of like you want to learn. And so I think really ask yourself if you're willing to learn and learn with others, not just I want to be this person in social media sphere and be known. And so I think just recognizing that, and also empowering yourself to try different means of social media, right? I think a lot of times people think Instagram or Twitter. And so I think really encourage other platforms that are not traditionally known and just do it, because at the end of the day, you never know where you find your own niche in your own community.
Katie?
All right, so I feel like I'm kind of going to flip this question around a little bit, but obviously, like, first step you can use to use social media, educate, is like, I think following, supporting, and amplifying frontline and BIPOC voices. Like, they're the experts, they're the ones who are fighting the fight, like, harder than any of us are. And I think that, like, showing their work and sharing that is like going to be one of the most effective ways you can really educate and like help this like fight for the climate. But also recognize that like this is the first step. Social media is like the first step for everybody. Like basically everybody is now like a digital native. Like we have all been, if you're like our age or younger or like around our age, like I would say that so many of us have been like raised in a world where like social media is just a fact of life. But know that like it goes beyond that. Like social media should be your starting point, and that's the springboard for you to get out in the streets post-COVID and everything, but that is the first step. So that'd be my answer.
Thanks, Katie. And I have to say, anybody's first step if they really want to start using social media for climate justice is to start practicing self-efficacy. If there's one thing I've learned this past year in running Climate Action Lab, it's that if you don't think that you're capable of making an impact, then chances are you probably won't. Like, think to yourself, when faced with a challenge, do you feel like you can rise up to the occasion, or do you kind of like back away? You see, like, when you believe that you have the ability to accomplish your goals, influence others, and make an impact, then you're most likely to. And folks who have high self-efficacy tend to develop a stronger sense of commitment to their interests and recover quickly from setbacks. So they bounce back stronger, which is important as an activist when you're bombarded with what feels like only negative news sometimes. So my final thing to say is trust that your work matters, because it does.
Amazing. And my last tip for everyone out there is to diversify your feed. Really focus on making sure that you're not just following big name influencers and thought leaders in this space. Follow smaller grassroots organizations, figure out who's in your community, not just bigger environmental organizations or nonprofits. Like, actually figure out who's located in your community, who's working on these issues, whether they're a government leader or a grassroots organization running a local food bank. There's so many people doing amazing work who aren't even on social media. So learn how to use social media as a tool for education and place-based storytelling and place-based education to mobilize the people around you in a way that makes sense to you. So we have such a short window of time for this Q&A, so we're gonna have to breeze through it, but we have like a few really great questions out there. So I would love anyone on the panel who wants to tackle one of these questions. If you could read out the question out loud and then give your answer, go for it.
Yeah, if y'all don't mind, I would love to address the first question in the panel or in the Q&A. I'm pulling it up right here. It's from an anonymous attendee, and I'll try to read it as fast as I can. How do you pivot people from talking about consumer actions that are Instagrammable, like buying a reusable straw, to actually doing the action that will make a change at scale rather than greenwashing, which is so important? It's easier to share a photo of bees wrap on Instagram than to make an image of overthrowing corporate power. I'm going to try to keep this short so I can let the other panelists answer too. But I think that's what's so powerful, and that's so true. And I know Katie said this earlier, like, your Instagram should not be your end all be all. That is simply your launch pad for taking action. And I think as a content creator in this space, in addition to educating, I think we also ought to provide the links and resources how to get involved and take that action. One really quick, easy thing that I love on Instagram, it's a feature like you could have a link in your bio, or, in your bio, right? And, it's great to link, where petitions are, where you could go to organize marches and meetups before COVID and after COVID, but really like directing people to resource centers where they can start taking action. I think that's really helpful and important, something that you can do on Twitter.
I'll also add, oh, sorry, Ariel, do you want to
go for it?
Okay. So this is, I feel like, something that Greenpeace struggles with a lot, because like we have a really large following, and a lot of people follow because we do a lot of plastics campaigning, and people think of like the issue of plastics as like a marine waste issue, and they like really just see it as an issue of like litter, and they want to see kind of like the actions that are Instagrammable, like your reusable stuff, but they also like really struggle and push back against like us connecting it back to like the fossil fuel industry and just like capitalism and basically everything else that's wrong, that is like the symptomatic, like, or not the symptomatic, the root cause of plastic pollution. Like plastic pollution is just a symptom. And for us, like, it's all about narrative building. It's all about education and narrative building. And like, you have to be the one to build the narrative and like make the connections and show people and lay it out and make it so obvious that people wonder how we ever like didn't really understand this. So I think really for us, like the first step in pivoting people from consumer action to like structural change and overthrowing corporate power is education and narrative building, and like doing it really, really intentionally and like never stopping.
Awesome. I want to give time for the other questions, but those answers blew me out of the water. That was so good. So I wanted to ask, I think this is more like for Ariel specifically. How do you balance sharing content made by others? It says, how do you credit or compensate them versus original content creation?
Yeah, I'll tackle both because the second one is sharing photos, not captions, and I feel like I can tie them in. So balancing content made by others. So I definitely never ask people to create any type of content for me. I only amplify work that people are already doing. So as far as compensation, I'm just sharing the work that they're already putting out there, as opposed to like hiring them out to do work that I want them to do. So of course, like I'll reach out and be like, hey, is that cool? Or, you know, if they've already given the permission, just share it. And of course, tag them and let people know what kind of work they're doing. And for the second one, for people and not captions, I would just say that videos are also really great. They're another tool. I would not discount videos at all. I would just say that if you are making photos and lengthy captions, whatever you should put in the caption, whatever is really important in the caption, put in the photo. But I wouldn't say don't share videos. I think videos are great as well. They're really useful. Just make sure that if you do have videos, you always have subtitles in case people can't hear it, then they can read it.
That's a great point. Yeah, definitely make your content accessible to folks with disabilities or hearing impairments. I think a lot of people, even myself, need to do a lot better job at that. And I really like this next question. So this question asks, this may seem like an elementary question, but I don't think it is. I think it's a great question. What sort of research do you do, like, to create your content, and how do you go about finding out who's in like your community or maybe even like your online ecosystem to get into this work? And I'd love Isaiah's to answer that question.
Yeah, I think most generally from a social media perspective, like there's a lot of hashtags that are on environmental justice, environmental racism. And so a lot of these digital creators use these hashtags. But I think the most important thing when you're looking within community orgs is honestly for me, like Googling environmental justice organizations in ... right? And so hitting those keywords gives you the opportunity to connect to those communities. But I think also too, what this question was asking about, like to find out who's in your community, it's just like read out, if you're on social media, read out their own content and see if you connect to it personally. Because I think the most important thing is that when you connect to someone's work and someone's content, you feel comfortable being in that space. And so I really recognize and like acknowledge that, like, if you're doing this type of work or you wanting to enter or trying to find out like what's happening, is do it in steps, because I think a lot of times it can be very hugely intimidating when you're just like, where do I start? So I think recognizing that where you feel most comfortable is like the most important step for you, and then building upon that.
Amazing. And yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of time left, but I would just like to ask each of you in like less than 20 seconds each. Yeah, like what is the one thing you want people to leave this conversation remembering moving forward? I know you said one step, but what is like the one thing you want them to really remember when they leave this? So yes, rapid fire. I'll start with Gia, and then we'll go down, and then I'll conclude.
Going back to my first point, and I'll try to make it concise. Your voice matters. You could do it. You could lead.
Love it. Okay, Katie, go ahead.
Need a minute to think.
All right, you have like 10 seconds. Isaiah.
I I honestly think it's recognizing your own self-love in this work. And so if you're passionate about something, you go for it.
Mine is, don't underestimate the power of mixing entertainment and education. Do not underestimate that at all.
Yes, Katie, I believe in you.
Okay, well, for me, I think it's just like create and like amplify the content that you would want to see personally. Like if you're thinking there are gaps in like something, like you want to learn about something, like look for it and share it, or make it and share it. Like, yeah, that's like your guiding thing. Like, what do I want to see?
I would make
I love it.
Point because
Thank you all so much. So we put all of our handles and information in the chat box. Unfortunately, the session has to end now. Tears, but you can connect with us on social media because that's the whole point of this. And thank you so much for attending this year's panel, Doing It for the Planet, Not the Gram. My name's Christy Drutman, the host of Brown Girl Green, and I loved moderating this panel. Thank you, everyone.
And shout out to Christy for organizing this. She has been amazing. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Do we hang out?